Hello everyone, welcome to the another video on Kubernetes Spring Cloud series. And today we will be discussing about Spring Eureka server. The Spring Eureka server is a service registry and it acts as a heart of all the microservice ecosystem. And Spring Eureka server allows registering all the microservice with itself with Eureka server, and it will allow to detect the microservice when it is going up or down. So it is kind of a heart of the Spring Cloud. So let us see project and we will see how we can create the manifest files. So this is my Eureka server project. If we look at the BOM of the Eureka server, it is using a Spring Cloud Starter Netflix Eureka server, and in the main file I have defined enable Eureka server. So this will enable the Eureka server. Also I have defined some properties for the Eureka server. So one is a service server port, then the application name and which profile it is going to use, and the config import. Now what it is doing is it is importing some of the properties from the config servers that we have deployed earlier. So if you look at, for example, the dev profile, and here Spring Eureka server dev profile. So here I also have defined some property like Eureka instance preferred IP true, the client fetch registry false, and also register Eureka with itself, Eureka. So I don't want the Eureka to get registered with itself, so I have set this property. So now what will happen is when we start a Eureka server, it will fetch the properties of properties from the config server. When we are running the Eureka server local, we can get properties from the local host for the config server, but when we are running a Eureka server on Kubernetes, we cannot access the local host. So as we are also deploying the config server into Kubernetes, if you look at this, I have deployed kubectl get pods. So I already have deployed my config server here, and I can get a service name. So if I want to access any API, then I can use the same service name, and then after I use the port from where it is using. So if we use this URL, then I can access the service in the Kubernetes. So we have seen that we need some properties that we need to define and we need to access. So what we will do is we will put some properties into the config map, and we will fetch those property into deployment and service objects. So one of the property is Spring application name, another is Spring profile active, and another is Spring config import. So these three properties I will define into the config map, and then I will use that into the Eureka server manifest file. So I will put three properties here. I already have created these properties. What I'll do is I'll copy these properties right here. So these three properties, right? One of them is Spring config import, Eureka application name, and API gateway application, not API gateway, I don't need it now. So these two properties, and I already have defined the Spring profile active. So for in this case we want to use the dev profile. So these properties I defined. Now if we look at the manifest file for the deployment and the service objects, we can see that this is the deployment as kind, then the metadata for the service name, and ticket service Eureka deployment. Then the label I am giving as a ticket service deployment, the same as the name. Then in the specs, the replica count that I want to use is 1, and then specs label, a template metadata label, I am giving the name as a app ticket service, and same name I am using into the selector match labels. Okay, and then in the pod configurations, I am giving the name of the container is ticket service Eureka server. I am using the image name as a cup of Java tech. I have already created a image and push that image into the Kubernetes. You also can push the image into the Kubernetes, not Kubernetes but Docker Hub. So I also have provided the Docker file here, so you should be able to push your, when you create a image locally, you can push into the Docker Hub using the Docker file that I already have created. For all the microservices, I have created a Docker file. Now first property that I want to use is Spring application name, right? So here is a Spring application name property, from where it is going to push it is going to pull the property is from the config map, application config map, right? And the property name is Eureka application name. So here if we check the config map, this is application config map, and the property is Eureka application name. So now when we run our manifest file, it will go here into the config map. It will pull this property application, pull this property from here, and then it will apply it right here. Similarly, the profile also, it will get the tab profile here, and also the Spring config import. This is Spring config import, right? This Spring config import, it will get it here from the config map, and the value is config server ts config server service 8888. So this is how it will fetch these properties. Now the service object, the Kubernetes service manifest file is the API version is v1, kind is service, and metadata that I am giving is ticket service Eureka server and the service. The selector it is using is ticket service Eureka server, and this is the same that I have given here, the selector. This is the selector, right, into the deployment object, and the port it is exposing is 8761 internal. This is the internal port, and the target port, that is the external port that it is using. So what I'll do is, I have this manifest file created. I'll go ahead and deploy that. So now, so let us go to the get pods. So now my Eureka server is started, right? So I can go into the browser and check it now that I am able to fetch it or not. I'll go to the localhost 8761, localhost 8761. Okay, now I can see that my Eureka server is also got deployed. So now we have deployed two services. One is a config server and Eureka server. Okay, so now we will, in the next video, we will deploy API gateway. And thank you for watching this video.